Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Audsley, and I'm the Writing Across Media Facilitator at Vermont Studio Center. Thank you so much for being here tonight. And I'm going to introduce our author. I'm so pleased to be hosting Christopher Castellani. Christopher Castellani's fourth novel, Leading Men, for which he received fellowships from the MacDowell Colony, the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and the Guggenheim Foundation, was published by Viking in February 2019. Leading Men was featured in Publishers Weekly, People, Entertainment Weekly, Interview, and was an editor's choice of the New York Times. His collection of essays on point of view in fiction, The Art of Perspective, was published by Graywolf in 2016. Chris is on the fiction faculty for the MFA Program for Writers at Warren Wilson College and the Bread Loaf Writers Conference. He lives in Boston, where he is artistic director of GrubStreet. We are very lucky to have Chris tonight, and I'm going to remove myself from the spotlight and turn the metaphorical virtual floor over to Chris.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you for having me. Thank you to all for coming. I'm so pleased to be able to share a little bit of this novel with you tonight. I'm going to read for about 20-25 minutes. And I was going to show you a copy of the cover of the book, but I'm currently traveling and don't even have a copy of my own book with me, so I can't even show it to you. I am going to read from this book. Now suddenly it has disappeared from my window. Give me one moment. Apologize for that. Okay, so I'm going to read from Leading Men. It's an alt historical novel told from the point of view of Frank Merlo, who was the partner of Tennessee Williams for 15 stormy years in the 1950s and early 1960s. The novel begins in the summer of 1953. The Anna he mentions in this is the great Italian film star Anna Magnani. And the only other thing that you need to know is that Tennessee Williams' nickname for Frank was the Little Horse. And I will start. This is actually the beginning of the book, but I skip around a little bit in the rest of the book. Truman was throwing a party in Portofino, and Frank wanted to go. The invitation came in mid-July, slipped between parentheses in the long, gossipy paragraphs of his letter to Ten, as if daring him to acknowledge it. Frank read the letter in Ten's absence. He'd been stuck for weeks in their stuffy fourth-floor apartment on Via Firenze, waiting for him to get back from Spain, while on the loud streets below, the real Romans were escaping for the mountains. He replied to Truman with a brief telegram, and then he called the finest hotel in town, the Splendido, to book a room. He auditioned various linen jackets and swim trunks and hats in the mirror above the dresser, mended 2 pairs of 10 socks, and walked their silks down to the cleaners. When 10 returned home to find their bags lined up in the hall, packed for another trip, he didn't protest. He was sweet on Frank again, after 3 weeks apart. A drive in the Jag up the coast of Liguria, far from the melting heart of the Centro, could only make things sweeter. They left Rome the next morning. Truman had rented an apartment a few steps from the harbor above the Delfino restaurant, which Frank and Ten passed on their way up the hill to the Splendido. Ten paid the boat guy to carry their luggage, and when the hill got too steep, Frank grabbed the heavy case with the typewriter. He didn't like it when another guy did work for him that he could do himself, a guy that would have been him if he'd never left Jersey. The Splendido was first a monastery, the boat guy told them, and now, look at it, the place Clark Gable drinks his brandy to a view. Ten went straight to the desk as usual, and Frank arranged their dress shirts on hangers and brought their shoes down for shining and stole another hour for a nap. He had never felt so tired in the middle of the afternoon, and he chalked it up to being 30. But it's possible, no doctor was ever able to tell him for sure, one way or the other, that the trouble had already started in his lungs. When he woke up, Ten offered him a pill. Ten had as many pills as Italy had houses on the water. But Frank wasn't taking pills, not then. Instead, he smoked another cigarette and paid the boat guy to drive him over the mountain to Paraji Beach, where he swam to find his strength and clear his head. They didn't like Truman much, but Frank didn't hate him the way Ten did, or maybe Ten didn't hate Truman. It was hard to know for sure with Ten. It was a job in itself, keeping track of who he was angry with and who was jealous of him, whose parties he was looking forward to, and whose they'd have to make up some excuse to get out of. Frank's official job was as Ten's secretary, but even his secretary didn't have a reason for being in Portofino other than to stop by Truman's party, and he didn't know when they'd be leaving. There wasn't much Frank knew in the summer of 1953, least of all how long he and Ten might last. In those years, there was no such thing as early, late, or on time. They went from place to place on a magic carpet, dropped here, dropped there, women in electric dresses, men in monkey suits and bow ties made of white silk, cognac, cigars, wine, the sky turquoise even when it was gray. Because Ten had no mind and little use for schedules and logistics and coordinates, he needed Frank to organize the day they woke up to and the coming days and even the days before. The dinner they'd had in London, Ten swore on his mother's grave they'd had in Chicago, the party for the Sweet Bird of Youth tryout in Philadelphia, he remembered as the one in New Haven for Camino Real. The life of Tennessee Williams was a memory play in which memory was a jumble. It was bodies that he remembered, bodies that they remembered together. His body and Frank's, the Southern gentleman and the little horse. When it came to matters of the body, Frank and Ten trusted each other like soldiers. At the Delfino, Frank lost track of him the first minute. Ten couldn't walk into a room without someone sweeping him up and into a crowd. How many times had Frank stood at the edge of the crowd as if on a shore, watching him drift farther and farther out, his head bobbing on the waves, glancing back just once to meet his eyes? How many times had Frank found himself in an overflowing room like this one, greeting guests as they arrived, recognizing their faces from movies and the backstages of theaters? How many times had these people walked in, looked around, saw Frank, saw nobody, spotted a somebody over Frank's shoulder, and then headed upstairs? A brass band started up. Frank danced with a French girl whose uncle watched from the bar. Girls liked to dance with Frank, and he with them. He had a way with a spin and a twirl and a catch and a bow, and this French girl, she could follow. That wasn't always the case with girls, even the fancy brought-up girls, but dancing with the clomping ones, even that was better than dancing with another guy, which he and Ten never did anyway, not with each other at least, not even in Provincetown. He saw the world a lot. He saw the world like that a lot then. What he did with Ten, what he had done with girls. He had his hands all over this Frenchie, Martine, until he noticed the uncle giving him the stink eye. He let her spin into some other man's arms. He brought a whiskey over to the uncle, not bad looking himself once he relaxed and the stink left his eye, and they got to talking. They'd both been at Guadalcanal. They traded stories loud over the music. When it became clear to the uncle that there was no money in Frank for his precious Martine, he took off in a cloud of leathery cologne. It was then and there that Frank first saw Jack Burns. Frank knew a drunk when he saw one. In a few years, he'd have good reasons to become one himself, to crave that slow, blurry kill. The night of Truman's party, he craved only the sea air, but for the air he had to get past the drunk slouched against the doorway of the Delfino. From across the room, in the low, smoky light, he might have mistaken the man for handsome, but as he walked toward him, into clearer focus came his pink, bloated face, his world-hating mouth, his body heavy and lifeless as a sandbag. Frank stopped to ask if maybe he'd come to the wrong place. "This isn't Portofino?" he asked. A man appeared behind him and put his hand on his shoulder to steady him or calm him or both. "We're here for the party upstairs," the man said. "It is privato." "This is the party," Frank said, "downstairs and upstairs, not as privato as you think." "We drove from Firenze," he said. He put out his hand. "I am called Sandro. This is Jack Burns, the novelist." Frank had never heard of him and doubted anyone else had either. Truman's parties drew all sorts of hangers-on, parasites, wannabes. The Gallery, said Sandro, the great war novel, a great work of American fiction, and two just as great novels since. Quit it, said Jack. He's modest, he's modest, Sandro said. He's working now on his great fourth novel. I forced him this weekend to take a break. I say, we go to the party of Truman Capote. We meet him in Firenze in June, and last week received the telegram with this address. So I say, we take the car and drive to see the little man with the funny voice. This place is lousy with writers, Frank said. Claire Luce, Jack Dunphy, Tennessee Williams. At those glittering names, Jack just rolled his eyes and swayed. We going in or not, he said, and headed for the bar. Please forgive, Sandro said. He has trouble with his book. He is a great man. Then he rushed to the great man's side. White yachts crammed the shallow harbor, their lights blazing, tinny music pouring into the crowded decks. In Portofino in midsummer, Truman's was not the only invitation to be had. It was even possible that these people standing along the railings talking and dancing in pairs had never heard of Truman Capote or Tennessee Williams, not to mention Jack Burns, that they'd never gone to the theater or finished a book or attended the symphony, that they were rich without culture. Frank would rather be poor. He might rather be dead. He was too young, his body too tight, to be almost 31. Soon his skin will come loose from his legs and upper arms, and his face will dry to a prune. Who'll want him then? He had no money in the bank. 10 signed his meager paychecks. Though he'd gifted him a fat percentage of the rose tattoo in perpetuity, if Frank had learned anything in their 6 years together, it was that plays had shaky legs, and that perpetuity wasn't so long in the end. He'd had 10 walk-ons in movies in the 40s, but the last time he'd walked onto a movie set, it was as 10's secretary. They were in LA for the premiere of The Glass Menagerie. Jack Warner had asked Frank, "And what do you do?" "I sleep with Mr. Williams," Frank replied, straight into the shocked eye of the millionaire producer. It was 10's favorite story. Just last week, he told it again to Anna. The two of them had laughed and laughed. Then he had slapped Frank on the back. The slap shrunk him to the size of the dog. But they were right to laugh. Other than sleep with Tennessee Williams, what had Frank Merlot done with his life? Back inside the Delfino, the crowd had thickened. He finally found 10 in the doorway of Truman's bedroom, talking to the two palest, blondest women he'd ever seen, one of whom was holding a white Maltese the size of a football. "There's the horse," he said, and grabbed Frank by the elbow. "These gorgeous ladies have me spellbound with the most delicious tale." He pulled them into a tight circle. "One of these is the mother, and one is the daughter. I dare you to tell me which is which." "Impossible," Frank said. They wore identical white iridescent shift dresses, the obvious mother in silver heels that brought her up to her daughter's exact height. They'd pulled their hair back in the same au courant style, which tightened the mother's skin almost enough to hide the marks of age. "Bitte Blomgren," said the mother. "Anya Blomgren," said the daughter. "And this is Maya," Bitte said, lifting the Maltese up to Frank's mouth as if he should kiss her. Weeks ago, Bitte was saying they had come to Portofino from her sister's cramped Vienna apartment by way of their home in Malmö to stay with a widower of obscene and obscure wealth who'd set his sights on making her his third wife. He'd set up mother and daughter in separate rooms above the kitchen on the eastern side of his villa. The widower slept until noon, but the girls were early risers. Each morning, a local fisherman, a brute with a smashed nose and hook-shaped scars on his bulging forearms, dropped off the day's prime catch in the widower's kitchen. From their shared terrace, Anya, sipping coffee and reading a novel while her mother wrote letters inside, gave the fellow a little wave as he came up the walk. Then another day, Bitte, leaning over the railing to admire the view while Anya bathed, wished him a buongiorno. His subsequent visits to their respective rooms were quick and rough and wordless. They had yet to determine which of them had him first. In fact, they were still unsure whether he was aware they were not the same woman. She would leave her door slightly ajar so that he'd find her sitting up in bed, pretending to be caught by surprise. That was Anya. Or she'd stand in the doorway in her white silk robe, pull him in from the hallway, and rarely make it as far as the bed. That was Bitte. Bitta recounted these details with matter-of-fact directness. The briny smell that lingered on her skin, his oily sunburnt chest covered in black hair, coarse as wires, the filthy boots he never removed, his calloused hands that sometimes bled, his animal grunts. She was bragging, trying to impress them. This happened all the time around 10. Spontaneous auditions. Frank believed little of it, least of all that this insatiable sea-wolf couldn't tell the two women apart. We men are connoisseurs of bodies. No matter how many we've tasted, they are as distinct to us as species of flowers. Our new friends have gone native, 10 said to Frank. It was the cook who'd betrayed them, according to Bitta, and the widower turned them out. Truman found them in an apartment in town until they could decide on their next move. Money was not an immediate concern. For Bitta, the only concern was, who will we be? She was a painter who aspired to marry, Anya a model who aspired to act. Our country is dull, Bitta said. To live, we require brightness. We're mad for it. Anya's mother spoke for her the way 10 spoke for his lobotomized sister Rose, as if Anya were too precious or too limited to choose her own words. Frank wondered if brightness was indeed what Anya required, and if anyone had asked her, and what exactly it meant. In the hour or so that Frank stood listening to her mother, elbowing out the parasites attempting to breach their circle, the only words Anya had spoken had been her name. That is, until Bunky, Truman's diva of a bulldog, entered their field of vision, and Maya leapt suddenly from Bitta's arms to greet him. The white puffball falling like a bomb startled Bunky, whose first instinct was to bite. Maya bit back, but she was no match. In the span of a moment, Bunky went stiff, bared her teeth, lunged, and took a big chunk out of Maya's side. In one motion, Bitta scooped Maya into her arms, turned her back to Bunky, and rushed out the door, her little dog whimpering and whelping and smearing her dress with blood. Sandro rushed over and dropped to his knees. Sono dottore, he said, and cradled the still raging Bunky at his side, which is when Truman appeared, hysterical, pushed Sandro out of the way and sank to the floor. He lifted Bunky above him to inspect him, twisting him this way and that. Truman was so slight, so much a tiny creature himself in his round glasses and floppy hair and flailing skinny wings. Not yet 30, he seemed far younger than Frank, a gawky child with practiced refinement and an alien brain. Where'd she get you? He cooed to Bunky in that impossible voice. His eyes and ears were all for him. She should be fine, Senor Capote, said Sandro, standing over him. There is no break of the skin. Thank you for this nice party. Who the fuck are you? Said Truman. Through all this, Jack remained out cold in the armchair. An assortment of twittering parasites then assembled around Truman and Bunky, rubbing Truman's back, scratching Bunky behind the ears. We saw it all, they whispered. We got here as soon as we could. Poor little Bunky. Poor Truman. Frank and 10 rolled their eyes at each other, smiling. This was how it always was. After entire nights apart, lost in a parade of strangers and giddy acquaintances, they reunited in the final hours, faded into a corner, the faces and lights and music and clinking glasses becoming a silent blur around them, a brief intermezzo scripted for them alone. Soon, someone would interrupt, lure 10 away, or they'd stumble home together, too drunk and tired to do much but collapse on the bed, still in their clothes, or they'd argue over some perceived slight and one of them would storm off again. But until then, for the brief time they found each other at the ends of these parties, they held one another's attention entirely, hungry for stories and kisses and gossip, as enraptured as they'd been on the porch in Provincetown the night they met. Two lovers locking eyes across a room. This was theater, yes, but it was something else too. Brightness, maybe. On that night, it was Jack Burns who came between them. You see that guy I came with, Sandro, he asked. There was some excitement, said 10, of which the party was in sore need. He's helping out a lady's dog, Frank said. That sounds like him, Jack said, bitterly, and the three of them set off to find him in the square. It was long past midnight, and crowds were still pouring steadily down from the hilly streets. In this way, Portofino was like the dozens of other port towns 10 had taken Frank to. People stood around with their ice cream cones, telling jokes and flirting and swaying to the music. Every once in a while, a startling burst of fireworks filled the sky over the fleet of boats. Then, slowly, as the ashes fluttered away with their eggy smell and the yachts cut their radios, couple by couple peeled off and staggered back up the steep, narrow inclines, men in each other's arms, men with women, packs of friends, their songs and shouts bouncing off the stone in hollow echoes. The colored lights strung from the lampposts stayed on until dawn, when the guys setting up the fruit stands and fish stalls unplugged them and the boats whirred to life. That's how it was the night the six of them, Frank and Ten, Jack and Sandro, Anya and Bitta, and the patched up dog, crossed the square to a nameless bar for a nightcap that none of them needed, and stayed so long talking, dreaming, planning, one nightcap turning to three, that the owner fell asleep, slumped in a chair, waiting for them to release each other. They emerged, squinting, into the second day of August, 1953. 10 years ago. Jack was gone now, of course, and Sandro lived blameless and cozy in some Tuscan hill town. Anya's most recent letter came posted from London, where she'd been cast in Carnival. She couldn't get to New York until the fall, she wrote, but by then surely Frank would be out of the hospital. She insisted on seeing him for the holidays in Madrid, where she'd purchased a floor-through apartment. Sometimes Frank imagined this apartment as his next home, the sloping stucco butter yellow walls, the wrought iron balcony that overlooked the tight, oppressed streets of the Plaza de San Andres. He'd roam these streets on his way to late night resistance meetings, provide aid to the artists, run money in arms for the movement. In this second imagined life, Frank is put to good use. What did you do for a living? The new nurse asked him. This was how all the nurses spoke of Frank's living now, in the past tense. She was moving him upstairs to a private room, she said, making chit-chat so he wouldn't ask why. I slept with Tennessee Williams, he said. That'll joke. How nice, she said. Her name tag said Faye Newton. She had a wide face and close-set eyes like an owl. I can walk, Fig, he said. It made him smile, an owl called Fig Newton. Maybe it was the gas. He walked around the ward to wish the other guys good luck. There were 10 of them now. It was the middle of the day and most were asleep. He sat on the edge of their beds to catch his breath between goodbyes. Frank was the only one with lung cancer. The rest of them had it in the liver or the brain. As bad off as he was, plenty worse had come through. You getting sprung? Asked Blind Sid. Every guy had a sick name. They gave them out to pass the time. That's what they tell me, said Frank. Blind Sid could use a little hope. Good for you, he said. I don't want to see you back down here. You won't see me no ways, Frank said in his best James Cagney. Blind Sid had been a carpenter for a living. Legs, the guy across from him, had been a postman. Pinky and Grumpy and Giggles had had office jobs. Robin Hood had sold real estate. Pluto had taught science at a high school in Teaneck. Muscles Marinara had managed a pizza shop. Cue Ball had painted houses. The horse, he'd been an assistant. Before that, he'd driven a truck and danced ballet and fought in the Navy and been an extra in some B movies, but no, nothing they would have seen. Mr. Merlot, said Nurse Fig from the doorway, I've got to get you upstairs. He patted sleeping Giggles on the chest. The walk back across the ward got him dizzy. Just this once, he said, and let her take him out in the wheelchair. In the elevator, he said, I did fine down there. It's not a place you want to be forever, she said. So that's where you're taking me, he asked. A place I'll want to be forever? For the past 3 months, Frank had been going back and forth from Ten's apartment on 65th Street to the Cobalt unit at Memorial. They'd hand him a long white gown, and then he'd lay on his back on the long table like the Bride of Frankenstein, his arms at his sides, his head immobilized in a steel chamber, 4 pins, thick as bolts, pressed against his jaw and temples to hold him still, while the doctor positioned a giant metal eye at an angle just over his heart. Ready, he'd say, just as the eye shot 200 beams of gamma radiation into his lungs. When it was over, the nurse unbolted him and sent him down the ward to rest. He hated the sight of the black burns on his chest, his tender, shriveled nipples, the rashes, his skin flaky and dry and sore, but it was the fatigue he hated most. He longed to swim, to dance, to fuck. When he woke each day in Ten's apartment, he vowed to do one of the three, but it took his strength just to get from the bedroom to the living room sofa, where he spent his days watching soap operas. Ten was always out somewhere. Still, they had a rhythm, a routine that could go on, and he didn't care what people said. It was bad luck to write his will before Indian summer came around. It was Blind Sid who'd told him about Indian summer. He'd been in and out of Memorial for 10 years and had seen it all. Every guy who'd come to the ward, Sid said, had had a stretch of time, a few days, a week, a month, when his muscles suddenly kicked back in, when he could eat a bowl of spaghetti and meatballs without barfing it up, when his mouth filled with spit and his dick with blood. You got no warning, but when Indian summer came, said Sid, that was when you took care of the legal business, said your goodbyes, made your confessions, gave the wife one last good screw, because winter was about to flatten you, and this time you weren't getting up. The last time Frank saw Ten was a week ago in the morning. He'd come into the bedroom while Frank was dressing. The car was downstairs for his 9 o'clock treatment. Let me help you, Ten had said. I can put on my own shirt, said Frank. As you like. Frank was wearing only his fluffy white robe. The lifting of his shirt from the hanger knocked the wind out of him. He waited for Ten to leave the room so he could remove the robe, but Ten just stood there, staring. The way you stare at a mouse you don't have the heart to sick the cat on. Their eyes met. And then, because Frank was already late and because Ten should see for once up close the entirety of his 98 pounds racked and gasping for air, the wreck of burnt bones the little horse had become, he let the robe drop to the floor. Jesus, Frankie, Ten said. He fell to his knees. He left town the same day, or so Frank was told. Milk train was opening in Virginia. Ten would have gone anywhere, though, made any excuse to escape him. Frank knew him like a book. He knew he paid for this private room on this quiet floor, for the oxygen tank, for the blinking machines, and the better meals, and the extra devotion of Nurse Fig, for the Frankenstein gown, and for the incinerating eye. He knew that this was the most that Ten would do here at the end of their long association. He pushed the button. He needed a blanket. He needed 2 blankets and the oxygen. Every shiver turned the vise tighter. But this place, it wouldn't hold him. Somehow he would get to Spain. Anya would smuggle him out. Ten used to tease him about these daydreams, how he always jumped ahead to a happy ending, a different way of ending happy each time. Even that first night in Portofino, in the nameless bar, Ten had proclaimed to their new friends with pride, there are roses tattooed in my Frankie's eyes. And he was right. Never, not for one moment, did Frank fear what Ten feared, what most men feared, which was that he would die alone. It was funny, wasn't it, Ten? Wasn't it almost funny? And I'll stop there.
Thanks so much, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you.
I know you worked on this book for a while and that it's been out in the world for a while, and that you've read a lot from it many times. But I am enamored and struck by the pacing of your sentences.
Thank you.
And
that means a lot coming from a poet.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'm wondering, and I'm also interested in the particular excerpt that you read for us this evening, the way that the fluidity of time in telling the narrative. Yeah, it really transports us as readers and listeners.
Thank you.
And I'm not sure if you want to speak to, I mean, I know that tomorrow morning you're doing a craft talk on the art of perspective, and that you've written an essay in a book. Well, that was in a book about, and you've given lectures on point of view. But point of view definitely seems like, on full display in this particular reading, this excerpt. In your novel, did you alternate point of view, or does it stay with Frank as the narrator throughout?
It's actually an alternating chapters, with Frank narrating one chapter and Anya, the woman that we meet in here, the young woman, narrating the other chapters. And her chapters are in the present, and like the 2015s or so. And her time in her sections goes always forward. In fact, she never does not want to look back. That is her thing. She just is always looking forward, and time moves more quickly in her sections. And then Frank's sections are move very slowly in time. It only covers about 6 or 7 days in his sections in 1953, but also as you saw in 1963, when he's in the hospital. So it's essentially he's narrating his sections from his deathbed. I hate to say it that way because it sounds so cheesy, or so like maudlin or whatever. But that's sort of technically the vantage point from which he's narrating his story. And so past and present, and also he's kind of, he's like past and present are existing very like,
simultaneously
to him. Yeah. And so that's why there's this kind of melding. But for this reading, I did combine a bunch of different scenes and make a kind of Frankenstein kind of reading. So to put a bunch of them together and string a narrative. But that is not so far off from how the book is structured as well. So, yeah.
I love, did you map a lot of that out when you were, yeah.
I had all kinds of elaborate charts, literally maps of, where they went in Italy and all of that, and also time maps and where each section was. And I was very sort of deliberate about, I didn't want to give the reader too many easy cues. Like I didn't put dates at the top of the chapters or make really deliberate, like I didn't use white space to like shift between time.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
And I thought I had given plenty of cues as to when, for a careful reader, I thought I'd given plenty of cues about how when it was switching back and forth. But I did hear from, I unfortunately read, some reviews where people were complaining that it wasn't spelled out enough when they were going back and forth in time. And I was like, I'm not going to spell it out for you. And it's also thematically resonant. Like, it's not, that's not how you experience time. Like, so I wanted to try to recreate that. And that was true only in Frank's sections. In the other sections, time was very clearly, it was very obvious where you were in time, but in Frank's, I kind of deliberately kind of melded it a bit. So. Yeah. Well,
yeah, I think that's very true to the way our memory works, recalling memory. We are both simultaneously in the present moment, but also in the past, and evoking feelings of deep nostalgia too. Exactly. If there is any question from the audience member, feel free to drop it in the chat, or you can unmute and ask a question. It's up to you. Chris, I'm wondering where you are. I know that this book is being turned, your novel that you worked many years on it has been optioned to be made into a movie. And I'm wondering how much you can share with us, and are you involved in writing the screenplay, and how is that process going for you?
I'm not involved in writing it, thankfully. I would have no idea how to adapt something I had written. I know I'm too close to it. To me, every syllable is essential, and that's that is not going to fly in a movie. And it's also, my whole goal for this book was to give Frank an inner life, and to really just get into his heart and his mind. And of course, screenplays are all external. They're all dialogue. They're all action. And so I would have had a very hard time doing it. But there is a wonderful wonderful screenwriter who's also a playwright. So it works really well because he loves Tennessee Williams, and his name is Matthew Lopez. He had this wonderful play called The Inheritance that came out a couple years ago, and it was one of the best play. I had actually read the play. Didn't get to see it, but I had read the play and was deeply, deeply moved by it. And I was so excited when I found out that he was writing the screenplay. And I actually just got to meet him. What's today? Thursday, like 4 days ago, for the first time.
That's amazing.
Yeah, it was really cool. And the screenplay, the draft of the script is done, and he's working with the director, who's Luca Guadagnino, who did Call Me by Your Name and a few other really great films. So they're working together on like kind of refining the screenplay, and they're going to spend time in Italy to do this. Sadly, I don't get to do any of this with them, but they get to be in Italy and do all these things, all because of me, all thanks to me.
They better fly you out. I mean,
Right?
come on now.
Come on. But I was told from the beginning, not by them, but by everyone I know who's had a book made into a film, that the writer's job is done. You have to just kind of give it away, you know?
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Okay.
So, but it's cool. I mean, the only thing I can say about the actual script is that I think it's okay to say this, but one of the lines that actually I read tonight was the life of Tennessee Williams was a memory play in which memory was a jumble. That's actually one of the guiding principles for the film. And so it actually speaks to your question as well. The film, from what, again, in its current state, it could change, but in its current state, it's going to be very much like jump cuts simultaneously past and present. So that signals to me that they understand the book and that they're taking that part of it seriously.
Good.
It's really cool that you honed in on that immediately. Like, and you know, maybe you should be a screenwriter too. Or
Oh no. I'm just a lowly poet. And the other line I really appreciated was that Frank would rather the people who are rich without culture, and that Frank would rather be poor, and be and have read books and everything. And I noted how I was interested to think about how, like, in our current contemporary culture, how people don't read, or like, and how it was simultaneously like a commentary on like that time, but it's still so relevant to today. Anyway.
I wanted to also, that was important to me too, because of a class issue, because Frank was a very working class Italian-American guy from Jersey. His parents were immigrants, very much like me. I am a working class Italian-American guy from Delaware, not too far from where he grew up, and my parents were immigrants. And he was actually better read than Tennessee Williams himself. And he was a veteran. He was in the Navy. He drove a truck. He was not the type of guy you would think would be, home reading, everything he could get his hands on. And he was surrounded. He found himself in this very rarefied world, right, of the glitterati, and probably many of them hadn't read like anywhere near as much as he had, So I wanted to kind of like, mark that contrast a little bit, and kind of, to say that, that intellect and artistic curiosity transcends race. Transcends race. Well, it does transcend race, but it also transcends class,
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Have the imagination is, being able to use your creative, imagination is freedom.
Exactly. And he was an aspiring, as you heard, like aspiring dancer, actor. He was a bit of a dilettante. Like he was very much wanted to be an artist, but he did not have the talent, and he didn't have the sort of stick with itness to see any of it through, any of the different art forms he chose through. And that was the source of a lot of tension between him and Tennessee. So anyway.
Well, it's interesting when you're a dabbler versus an expert, but there is an art in dabbling too, because you need to be able to shift and have the skill set to like move in between different mediums.
Exactly. And like I said, I admired his curiosity. He was interested in all kinds of art. I mean, he knew opera up and down. I mean, he was like an opera savant. Yeah.
Was doing the research for this project like going down like a million different rabbit holes?
It really was. And I mean, there's so much that I did and like literally did and like went to places and put myself in certain situations, like walked certain paths and did certain things that the characters did do in real life that I never used, you know, and so many different permutations of the plot and that, I mean, you know, it just took forever. I mean, it really took 20 years. I mean, I wrote other books in the meantime, but I kept going back to this project over a 20-year time.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, really tinkering with it. I didn't really sit down to write it in earnest until 2015, I think. And it came out, you know, 4 years later. But I'd been living with it for all that time and reading biographies and doing various types of research all that time. So
it was always running in the background, it sounds like.
Yes.
That sounds wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
No, it was great. I loved it. I'm actually sad that I only got one chance to write this book because I would, you know, it was the project I was most excited to work on, like my whole life. Since I met Frank on the page, I read about him in a biography, just, you know, by chance. I picked up a biography of Tennessee Williams in a bookstore and I started reading about him. And I had no idea that the great love of Tennessee Williams' life was this working class Italian-American guy like me from Jersey. And so I became instantly obsessed with him. And then when I found out, it was so poignant that he died of lung cancer at the age of 40. And that Tennessee, like, they had been estranged, you know, as you heard a little bit in the piece, they've been estranged, and Williams would not come to see him. And all of Frank's friends, all of Tennessee's friends, Truman Capote, Vivian Leigh, all these sort of fancy actor types, like, would all came to visit Frank, and everybody but Tennessee. But Tennessee eventually did visit him, and that finally the day that he visited him was the day that Frank died. So it was like he was waiting for him, you know. And so I read that's factually, you know, that is the facts of what happened. And I read that, and I was just instantly compelled by and moved by that kind of story. So, yeah.
I know that this is my last question, unless there's a question that anyone else wants to ask. Mm-hmm. But my last question, and thanks, Chris, so much, is that I know you're in a writing group in the Boston area where you live and work, and I'm wondering how instrumental that, or what is your relationship with writing groups and sharing work? And I have a love-hate relationship with workshop. Yes. And, you know, but I still appreciate like someone giving me a really good close read on my work. And there are certain people I trust to do that. And I was wondering if you could talk about the writing group that you're in and sure. What that might mean for whoever's listening, and if they're a writer and is working, if they are working on a project themselves.
Sure. You know, I'm a believer in, I mean, I think I am a believer in the workshop process, you know, but I also am a believer that it has a shelf life, right? That you don't need to do it forever, you know, that you sort of get as much as you can out of working through various drafts of various pieces through workshop. And then eventually you find readers, one or two readers who you exchange work with, and having a kind of singleness of their vision with yours is actually a better way to I think of workshops as like the minor leagues, frankly, and then and then one-on-one workshopping, like where you just exchange work as like the major leagues. But I feel like you have to play in the minor leagues for a while, right? And you have to like have that experience of having a bunch of different voices on your piece and trying to navigate through all of that to then write your own version of it. I think that's hugely important for development of our work. And I've been in many workshops like that.
Yeah.
And we still do that in our writing group. We still have like group workshops, like whether 8 or 9 or 10 of us, I forget how many are in the group. But those are more like, they're not traditional workshops where like, you know, you have to be quiet and you have to listen and you can only talk about certain things. It's more of a conversation. It's more of a generative conversation. And then what usually happens is that from that workshop, people emerge as like, okay, well, you know, this person is actually really getting this project that I'm doing. So I'm going to actually exchange work one-on-one with them.
Oh, great. Yeah.
And so it's almost like a feeder, you know, and then when we all kind of like take turns kind of reading each other's stuff like one-on-one. And the workshop becomes more like just a deadline, like of keeping us accountable. Like we have to submit to the workshop, not so much so we can have the workshop, but just so that we can hold each other accountable. So yeah, and I'm a huge believer in writing groups, but for that reason mainly, and as a support system. But I really believe that they have to happen organically. Like I know so many people. I work at GrubStreet and have been part of the Bread Loaf community and the Warren Wilson community and other writing communities. And you always see people like posting flyers like, I want to be in a writing group. Like, let's have a writing group. And while I sympathize with the need to find a writing group, I feel like it's almost impossible to have a random writing group people come together. I feel like it has to happen organically. You take a workshop together and you kind of find the people who you vibe with, and then they find the person that they vibe with, and you join up, and it has to kind of build and accrue, which is how our group did, and then from that you can build something. But it just can't be like random. I say that because so many people, that's what they think they need to do, is just go online and find a writing group, and it's like it's really not as easy as that, unfortunately. So
yeah, I think also because I've been in different combinations of exchanging of poems in different configurations, and also some things have started and some things have stopped. Like, you know, like just naturally they peter out, and that's okay too. But yeah, no, I definitely think like there's definitely like a level of trust and just like, you know, also, yeah, I need to trust the person and also like care too about their work. Also, like, it's like not just my work, it's also the other person's work too that I want to I'm invested in. So.
Exactly. Yeah, that's right. I mean, you kind of have to be all fans of each other on some level, you know, like you have to have respect for what they're doing, even if you may not always think it's working. Obviously, who cares? But overall, you have respect for their artistic abilities or ambitions or sensibility or whatever. It has to. I mean, it's a big commitment, and you have to really, and it requires a lot of trust and a lot of love as well. And so it's what I mean. You can't just find that by putting up a flyer as much as we want to, you know?
Yeah.
So it does, you have to be patient and find the group.
Yeah. And yeah. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you for reading that excerpt. I wish you well, and I look forward to seeing you tomorrow morning.
I'll see you tomorrow morning.